With the theory out of the way, we can start working with the actual control nodes inside of Godot. There are two things that I want to do in this video. Number one, we are going to learn about the simplest control node, color rectangle. This one doesn't do very much, it just displays a color. Which is perfect, because that way we can focus on the layout system itself. Here we are in Godot, and I want to create a user interface. This I want to rename right away. Let's call it layout basics, which I want to save inside of a new folder. Let's call it scenes, and then layout basics.tscn is totally fine. Via that, we're getting a layout scene. You can tell it is one because of these green needles. Those define the anchors, which I will talk about a lot in this video. For now though, I want to add another node, which is a color rectangle. If you are adding that, you are getting a white rectangle in the top left of the window. This node doesn't do very much, but if you look in the inspector, you can change the color. Let's go with a blue-ish value. Although the specific value here doesn't matter whatsoever. Choose whatever you like. This node we can place like a sprite 2D, meaning you can drag and drop it and place it wherever you like. If you look in the bottom left, you can see its XY position, which is kind of alright, but not how you are supposed to use control nodes. Instead, you want to look at layout, and in there, you're getting quite a few options. The one that we care about at the moment is called layout mode, in which you have position and anchors. Via position, you're placing the control node with X and Y values. But that's not something we want to do at the moment. Instead, we want to work with anchors. Once you have that, you get anchor presets. And there are quite a few, but I don't care about them. I want to go with custom. And then you're getting 3 tabs: anchor points, anchor offsets, and grow direction. For now, I only care about anchor points, which are all 0 at the moment. And to only focus on them, I want to go to anchor offsets and set all of these values to 0 as well. All of this should be 0. This makes the color rectangle disappear. We only have a red dot left in the top left of the window, which is the intended behavior. And now, to understand these 4 values, let me draw on the screen. The left attribute defines the distance from the left side of the node to the left side of the screen. At the moment, this is 0, so we are here for the node. The same applies for the top. This value is 0, so the distance from the top of the node to the top of the screen is here. Right and bottom are slightly different in the sense that we are now defining the distance from the right side of the node to the left side of the screen. For the bottom, we are defining the distance from the bottom of the node to the top of the screen. I guess a good way to think about all of these values is that we are defining the relative distance to the top left of the screen. I want to leave left and top at 0 and 0. So the node is always starting in the top left of the screen. But for right, I want to set this to 0.2. That way, we are already covering quite a bit more distance. Or in other words, the right side of this node is 20% of the screen width from the left side of the screen. If we then set a value for bottom, let's say 0.5, then the bottom of the node goes to the halfway point of the screen. Or in other words, we're adding half of the screen width to the bottom of the node. And these values you can change as much as you like. If I move them around, you can see it quite well how this is working. If you play around a bit, it should become fairly straightforward. So there you can see we can move this thing around as much as we like. And a really important thing that you have to understand at this point is that these numbers are relative. Let me run the game. At the moment, this rectangle is roughly in the top left of the window. And this stays the same regardless of how I size this thing. We are always in the top left. This would even apply if I position this thing in the bottom right. Let me change the values just a bit. I want to change right to roughly 0.9, the bottom also to roughly 0.9, then the left should be let's go with 0.8-ish, and the top can also go 0.8-ish, like so. If I now run this thing again, the rectangle is in the bottom right, and if I resize the window, we are staying in the bottom right, and that is super valuable. For example, in a real game, this could be some kind of coin indicator or a minimap that you always want to be in this position, regardless of the screen size. And especially if I compare this to a Sprite 2D, let me add one. Sprite 2D with the Godot logo. If I simply place this one in the bottom left and run the entire thing again, I can resize the window and this kind of works unless I scale it down a bit more. At some point, the Godot logo disappears because this one is placed with absolute values. There's always the same distance to the top left. And this doesn't change, meaning if the window becomes too small, this node disappears entirely. But the control node is different. It's relative. Or in other words, the size of the window doesn't really matter for its placement. And that is pretty much how control nodes work on a very basic level. Let me get rid of the Sprite 2D, then focus on the color rectangle. And also, I guess we can clean up these values just a bit. 0.8, 0.8, 0.9, and 0.9. That just feels a little bit better. Besides these anchor points, we can also set anchor offsets. Those are in pixels. And really what they are doing is they add pixels to any of these sides. For example, for the left side. If I make this value positive, we are moving the entire thing a bit further to the right. Or rather, to be more specific, we are moving the left side of the node a bit further in this direction. Right now it's negative. If it's positive, we are making the entire rectangle smaller. And this applies to all of them. That way you can really fine-tune how all of this works, and these values can also be animated, which can create a really nice menu effect, for example. I guess at this point what we can do is to add a few more examples just to make all of this really understandable. This color rectangle I want to rename to bottom right rectangle. Besides this rectangle, I want to add another color rectangle that I want to rename to mid bottom rect. This could, for example, be a health bar that is always roughly here. Let's make it red just to illustrate the point a bit better, like so. Once again, the color does not matter. The layout mode should be anchors and the preset should be custom. Then for now, I want to remove the anchor offsets and only work with the anchor points. For the left side, I want to have 0.25. For the top, I want to have 0.8. For the right side, 0.75. And for the bottom, 0.9. That way we are covering 50% of the available screen width. You simply have to subtract the right from the left side. On top of that, on the left side and on the right side, we are getting 1/4 of the screen each. Then to the top, we're getting 80% of a distance, and to the bottom, we're getting 10% distance. And that way, we are getting a scene where we always have a health bar in the middle, and it doesn't matter what size the screen is. This thing stays in the same position. And by the way, while testing these sizes, you want to have this icon selected. That way you get the entire available space and it doesn't look weird and cramped. Now, alternatively, what you could also do, if you want to have a set distance between the bottom of the bar and the bottom of the screen, you could set this value to 1. That way, at the moment, we are right at the bottom, which makes the entire thing a bit chunky. Let's set the top to 0.9. After that, you can use the offsets to give this thing a set offset to the bottom. For that, you want to work with the bottom and then give it a very small value, let's say -15. With that, you can see it via the green needles. These define the anchors, or the distance to the screen border. Those define the edges at the moment, except for the bottom, because there we have an offset, which can be super handy in some cases, especially if you want to have a lot of consistency in your game, which is generally a good idea. Let's do one more example. I want to have another color rectangle that should be in the top left. So let's call it top left rectangle. This rectangle could later on become a container for hearts, like in a Zelda game. So I want it to be roughly here in the top left, with a bit of an offset to the top and to the left. For that, once again, I want to go to Layout, Layout Mode, Anchors, and then for now, Custom. The anchor offsets can also be 0 and 0. And then, for the left side, I want to have 0. For the top, I want to have 0. For the right, I can go with 0.2, and for the bottom, 0.1. That way, we are in the top left, and on top of that, via some offsets, we can add, let's say, 10 pixels to the left and 10 pixels from the top. And then you get the size for some hard containers in the top left, like in a Zelda game. Alternatively, what you could also do is not use anchor points at all, like so, and instead only work with the offsets. So let's say you always want to have a set size for the hard containers. Then you can make the right side 100 and the bottom, let's go with 50. Maybe a bit too much, I guess. Let's say the right side can be 200. That way, if I run this scene again, this container is going to have the same size no matter what. If I scale this window to something really small, it is going to keep the same size, which is sometimes what you have in mind, but it really depends on your project. Just keep in mind, it is something that you can do. And well, with that, we have covered the basics of the layout system. If you understood all of this, you already know half of the layout system in Godot. It doesn't get that much more complex from here. The next important concept that we have to talk about are containers. To understand what they're doing, let's talk about a problem. Very often, you want to place multiple control nodes in a specific pattern. For example, you might want to have a grid or have nodes that are right next to each other. To get that kind of layout, you could work with anchors, but it would be really tedious. To avoid all of that work, Godot has containers. These are controlling the anchors of their children and arrange them in specific ways. For example, we have an HBox container and a grid container. The HBox container places nodes right next to each other. A grid container gives you a grid. Back in Godot, I want to create a new scene, which is also going to be a user interface. Let's rename it right away to container base6. Save this one in the same folder. Save. This is totally fine. Now I guess for all of this, we can get started by illustrating the problem. Let's say I have a color rectangle where we are setting anchors via custom without any offsets. And this thing should go from left 0, top 0, and then right 0.1 and bottom 0.1. That way we are somewhat in the top left. Next up, I want to have another color rectangle that is right next to it. This we could get by simply updating the anchor points, where left is going to be, let's say, 0.15, and then the right side is going to be 0.25. Via that system, we get two color rectangles right next to each other, at least roughly, with the same size. But that only worked because we have set very specific numbers. So it's something you can do, but something that isn't really reliable and also very labor intensive. Hence, not what I want to do. Instead, I want to create another node which is going to control their sizes. And those you can find inside of containers. There you have a whole bunch of containers, and what they all have in common is that they override the anchors of their children. The easiest one to understand is inside of box container. There we have HBox and VBox container. I want to start with HBox container. Click on create, and now we are getting, let me hide the color rectangles, we are getting another node that at the moment is not visible at all, which is totally fine. The interesting thing happens when we are placing the two color rectangles inside of it. Let me add them as children, and then the color rectangles disappeared even though they are visible. On top of that, if I look at the first color rectangle in the inspector, we cannot select the layout mode anymore. That is because all of this is now controlled by the HBox container. But now you might be asking, why can't we see these color rectangles anymore? And that is because if you look at the top, we are getting a new tab. And in there, we can set this to expand, which I want to do for both color rectangles, like so. And then we are getting the two rectangles right next to each other inside of the container. If we change the size of the container, they are also expanding. Let's get something like this. Then you can see it a bit better. The really important thing that you have to understand is that when we're adding the color rectangle to this HBox container, The HBox container makes the node as small as possible. Or to be a bit more specific, inside of a color rectangle, you have a custom minimum size, which by default is 0 and 0. When you're adding the node to a container, this is the size you are getting. I'll talk about this concept in a lot more detail in another video. For now, don't worry too much about it. Instead, what is super important is that inside of this node, we can tell the color rectangle to expand. Or in other words, we are telling it to take up as much space as possible. This only works on the horizontal axis. On the vertical one, we are always taking the entire available space. Or if I disable this value, the second color rectangle, because it is expanding, takes up all of the space, and the first color rectangle doesn't get any. But we are still taking up all of the vertical space. And I guess for now, this thing should expand as well. Now, besides that, inside of the inspector, you can still make some minor changes. For that, you want to look at container sizing. In there, you're getting the same options that we can see up here. But on top of that, you're also getting a stretch ratio. This tells Godot how much this node should take up in relative terms. Right now, color rectangle 1 and 2 have the same stretch ratio. But if I set the stretch ratio to 2 for the second one, then this thing is going to take up twice as much space as the first one. And that is kind of all you have to know about the HBox container. It doesn't get that much more complex. Besides that, I want to add another container, which is called the grid container. And let me move this one a bit to the side, roughly here. In a real project, you would want to use anchors for all of this, but just to keep the video shorter, I'm going to keep it at position. It's just faster to work with. To this grid container, I want to add another color rectangle, which once again by default you cannot see, because Godot by default scales it down to the minimum size, which is 0 and 0, so we cannot see it. But if you look at this top tab, we can expand it on the X and Y axes. That way it takes up as much space as possible, which at the moment is the entire container. Now, if I duplicate this color rectangle, we are getting a couple of rows. That is because inside of the grid container, when you're looking at the inspector, we only have a single column. But if you increase this value, you're getting more columns, which is pretty much all that you can do inside of a grid container. Now, on top of that, what you're also able to do is to combine multiple containers. Let's say to this grid container, I want to add a VBox container, which is the same as an HBox container, except now we're working on the vertical axis. To that thing, I want to add more color rectangles, which once again, you have to set to expand. Now for the vertical alignment. If I then duplicate this color rectangle, we are getting multiple columns inside of the grid container, which is already becoming a bit more of a complex setup, which is fairly easily done via the containers. And I guess just for comparison, try to imagine doing all of this by only using anchors. It would take ages and it would be really finicky. Now besides that, we do have quite a few more containers, but they are all slightly more specific. If you look at containers, for example, we have an aspect ratio container, or we have a center container that always centers an element. I guess we can add that one. Just for some examples, we have a center container, and to that thing, we have to add another color rectangle, which once again, by default, you cannot see because of the minimum size. And for this one also, you cannot set it to expand. Instead now, to see the color rectangle, you have to change the custom minimum size to, let's say, 100 and 100. That way you can see it again inside of the center container. Once again, I'll talk about the minimum size in another video. But I think for now, let's do one more example, which is going to be the margin container. Via that, you are adding margins. I think the name describes it fairly well. Let's place it down here. And then once again, add a color rectangle to it, which right now is covering the entire available space. The margin container is this one, and the color rectangle takes up all of the space. Once again, expanding doesn't do anything. On top of that, if you look at layout, you can't really do very much in here. I guess you can set a stretch ratio, but that just doesn't do anything. Instead, to work with this one, you want to have the margin container selected, and then go to Theme Overrides. In there you have constants, and there you can set the margin for every single side. Let me activate them all, and then for margin left, we can go with 10, margin top 20, 30, and I guess 40. That way, we're getting specific margins around this color rectangle. Now, this is usually only used to set specific styles, which is why it's inside of Theme Overrides. Most of the time for the layout only, you can get these offsets by using the offset itself. I will talk about that in the next video in a bit more detail actually. But I think for this video, we have covered containers, and I hope at this point all of this makes sense. Let's talk a bit more about anchors and containers. Most importantly, I want to talk about presets. Because besides defining your own anchors, you can also use presets, which sometimes you want to do, but most of the time it's just a more convenient starting point for your actual layout. Meaning you're basically always going to use a custom layout, but to get what you want faster, you can start on a preset. On top of that, inside of a container, you can change the scaling behavior. Like in Godot, I want to create a new scene. Let's call this one 3 sets. I want to save this one in the normal space, and then I can add a color rectangle like we have seen before. And so far, we always went to layout and then set anchor position via custom. But besides custom, we have all of these options. And these, by the way, are mirrored when you're clicking on this button up here. The only difference is that you don't get the text next to it, but that doesn't really matter that much. For example, if you click on this one, you are filling the entire rectangle. If you click on this one, you're filling the center. You can be on the left side, the right side, the center, and so on. I think you get the idea. Most of the time though, this isn't exactly what you want. So maybe you want this as a starting point, but go a bit further down. This you can do. After you have set the preset, you can always go to custom and then customize these values. You keep the values from the preset. For example, at this point, I could add an anchor offset at the top to go a bit further down, something like this, and that's really all I had to do. Can be quite handy. For now, let's go with full rectangle. Besides that, the other button you have in here is this anchor symbol. To understand what this one is doing, let me first of all just resize this thing. If I do that, we are effectively changing the offsets. Or in other words, if I go to the anchor preset and custom, the anchors are still at 0, 0, 1, and 1. We are covering the entire screen, which is what we have gotten from the full rectangle. But to get to this position, we have a right and a bottom offset. So in other words, if we only direct these points, we are only changing the offsets. However, if we have this button selected, then we are also changing the anchors. And that's all that this button is doing. If you have it selected, you change the anchors. If you don't have it selected, you are changing the offsets. That's pretty much it. And I guess while we are here, one tab that I haven't covered yet is Grow Direction. This one by default says right and bottom, although when you're changing these presets, this can change. So what does that actually do? And for that, let me keep custom, change these things back to bottom and right, and also use the center preset. That way, this rectangle is right in the center without any size. Although we can give it a size with the custom minimum size. Let's give it a size of 100 and 100 pixels. If I now go back to custom, we have the grow direction for horizontal and vertical set to both. But if I change that to right, then we are growing to the right. And if I change it to left, then we are growing to the left. In other words, if I change the custom minimum size, we are growing to the left direction right now, because for horizontal, we have set left. This also works on the vertical axis. At the moment, we're growing in both directions because this is set to both. If we're setting it to top, we'll be growing in this direction. Effectively, grow direction tells you in which way we are growing when the minimum size is changing. And I guess the most important thing about it is that it changes depending on the preset. If you, for example, have the top left preset and you go to custom, then this thing is right and bottom. Just keep that in mind. It can be quite important. That's the first thing I wanted to cover. Next up, I want to create another HBox container. Let's scale it up a bit. And let's add a few more color rectangles to it. That should all be set to expand. I guess 4 is okay. And then, with the first one selected, we're getting a bunch of options for the horizontal alignment. So far, I only covered expand. Besides that, we have these 4 options. The default one is fill. But besides that, you could also use this one, and this one. And that way, you are only covering part of the available space. Right now, we can't see anything, but if we give the node a custom minimum size, let's say 20 pixels, then you can see this a bit better. We are simply taking up some of the space, but not all of it. That we only do if we are filling the space. This also works on the vertical alignment. There you can decide if you want to have the entire available space, just the bottom, just the center, or just the top. Once again, if you have a custom minimum size of, let's say, 40, then this is going to look much better. And that is pretty much it in terms of presets. Once again, you can find those either up here, or you can find them inside of container sizing. That's kind of all you need to know about it.